Hey everyone, and welcome back to another edition of MedHeads. This is MedCityNews.com's regular weekly look at the business of healthcare and the week that was in innovation in healthcare. My name is Chris Seper. I run MedCityNews.com, and I'm joined by three esteemed panelists, two of them from MedCity News, and we're lucky to have a special guest this week. Joining us is Meghana Keshavan. She writes about innovation across all of healthcare. Meghana, how you doing?
I'm great. Great.
With a focus on the life sciences. Sorry, I forgot about that. We also have Stephanie Baum, who writes about digital health in the early stage. Stephanie, how's life?
Life is good. How about with you?
Can't beat it. And then, of course, our guest is David Kroll. He's a pharmacologist, and he's also a pharma and healthcare contributor to Forbes. David, thank you for joining this Peabody-winning Google Plus on-air hangout broadcast.
Absolutely. It's an honor and a pleasure.
That's great. Well, one of the things that happened this week, we got yet another reminder of the way things are changing so rapidly when it comes to genomics and precision medicine. Pathway Genomics, which Stephanie will talk about in a little bit, had some pretty impressive news, and it just was a reminder to us that precision medicine, genomics, the way consumers are going to be able to get that information is probably one of the biggest stories of this year, and we want to spend some time on it. David's joining us in part because he's going to moderate a discussion at MedCity Converge in a few weeks in Philadelphia around this very topic. And so we want to dive deeper into it, have a good conversation about it. Meghana, Stephanie, and David obviously have covered it intensely, and so let's get started. And actually, Stephanie, let's get started with you. Like I said, we could talk about 23andMe, we could talk about Theranos, we could talk about a whole host of things, the FDA's decision, but you gave us something this week about a new company that's really focused on the space.
Sure. Pathway Genomics actually developed a genetic test that allows people to evaluate or optimize, rather, their diet and fitness regimen based on kind of seven markers in their genetic profile. And they developed this test a while ago, but this week they made it available in an app form. And the idea is that if you're interested in getting this test done, then you would use this app to contact their online network of physicians that would order this test, and then that would set the ball rolling for you to get this evaluation. And the idea is that it would, maybe there are certain diets that wouldn't work as well for you as others. If maybe, if you want to be, you envision yourself being like the next Arnold Schwarzenegger of the weightlifting world. Maybe this will kind of cut those aspirations short and say, hey, you're never going to bulk up because you're just not genetic. You just don't have that genetic background that you need for that. Instead you should focus on marathon racing or steps or just a nice walk around the park or something. It is kind of interesting because they also have a collaboration that they initiated with IBM Watson last year. It's not for that particular app, but they are interested in using natural language processing so that people can ask more intelligent questions, more informed questions about their healthcare needs, their healthcare decisions. And it's interesting that they see these two things as being, advancing people's access to care and self-management.
So that's really where we are today. And David, one of the things that you wrote about when it happened was when the FDA made a decision that allowed, essentially, and you can reprise this too, basically allowed companies like 23andMe to begin doing genetic testing directly for consumers again. There was a ban of that for a time. It's interesting that Stephanie talked about it there. Testing and other screenings that can tell you whether you could ever be a great weightlifter or a great marathon runner. I think the comparison you used was around cilantro, right?
Right.
Can you talk about that FDA decision and then talk a little bit about how you've seen that kind of ripple out?
Well, I think I think what originally happened when 23andMe came on the scene and started selling their spit kits to people was that I think there was concern, particularly with regulators, that that they might be overselling information and reading too much into correlative studies between a certain polymorphism and a specific trait outcome or a disease sensitivity. And the FDA takes that stuff very seriously. Is when you're using something, we may think about it as something for fun, and like Steph said, doing something for exercise. The issue is when you start talking about disease risk or your ability to metabolize drugs, you're talking about medically actionable information, and that's when it starts to get serious, and that's where issues of reproducibility and how robust it is get into the situation, get into the decision making, and then that's why FDA acted about 18 months ago to tell them that they can't do that, and 23andMe decided they were going to take that off, just be simply a type of ancestry geotime lineage service, and people like me who were customers before could still get access to their health trait information. But I think the issue was, were they overselling certain traits, right? And so you said that, Chris. I talked about preference for cilantro and whether you perceive it as unpleasant or whether you like cilantro. And the specific polymorphism they picked only had a 10% preference, only indicated a 10% preference towards cilantro. Okay, so to me, I mean, I don't know how they statistically found that to be different than the control allele, but a 10% difference for me would be noise. Now, we're not talking about something where it's a trait that makes you six-fold greater a lover of cilantro. So this one's a little less serious, right? Because it's our talking about preferences in the diet. But like I said, when you start talking about disease prevalence or disease risk, you start to get into serious things that they're actionable without the input of another healthcare professional who could help interpret those things and the I guess sort of the relevance of that data.
Well, yeah, and that was, I mean, that's the big concern, right? I mean, people saw what happened with BRCA1 and 2, the breast cancer gene. I mean, people would find out they had a preference or a disposition out of BRCA1 and 2, and they'd go get double mastectomies. And as more information and more education came out, it became pretty clear that that was pretty extreme, considering the rate and the opportunity and the issues there. But and so now a lot of the medical community are rightfully saying, 23andMe giving this information, or any organization giving that kind of medical information directly to the consumer, is the consumer really going to be empowered enough to make that decision?
So that's a question too. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, go ahead, Dave. Exactly.
Oh no, what I was going to say is that that was a case where with BRCA1. Having a mutant gene is extremely significant, but for an extremely small percentage of women, and so it's an actionable trait, but it applies to so few women, and I think the concern there was that women were already going into their doctors with a preconceived notion of how radical of a preventive surgery they'd want to have, and it's not to say that you shouldn't have that information to start thinking about making those decisions, but if it influences your ultimate decision to do something so drastic, I'm surprised that doctors or surgeons would act upon that information without doing additional testing of their own, and issues of family history of breast and ovarian cancer, for example.
Well, and let's. I want to touch back on that, but I want to circle over to Meghana. That goes down to the issue of what's happening on the ground with physicians and how they're using genetic information right now, how it's being used by physicians. And so, Meghana, when you often look at it that side, what do you see?
Well, I just wanted to circle back actually and just touch on what you were talking about with the BRCA stuff. I do think that when it comes to bringing consumers into this whole precision medicine something, I do err on the side of caution also, because there are just so many different genetic factors that'll lead to that cancer as opposed to not. So I mean, it's one thing to have control of your or have access to your information, but you need to as you said, you need to have the correct metrics telling you what's going on. And it just reminds me of this company called Deep Genomics. I spoke about it a couple weeks ago too, but there's this company called Deep Genomics out of Toronto that's, using artificial intelligence to, pull together little parts of the genome and, spit out whether or not you actually do have a likelihood for the cancer or whatever. And I think that we need more tools like that in place before we really can draw conclusions that are strong enough to just give it straight into the hands of patients. That being said, yeah, you're asking about the hospitals. I don't know, this week something kind of cool came out of UCSF, which I thought was interesting, that is a really good application of precision medicine because it's taking an algorithm that'll, piece together, the genome quickly and figure out if a hospitalized patient has a virus, bacteria, fungus, or parasite, and tells you what kind it is, and it's a rapid diagnostic that is derived through next-gen sequencing, and it will empower the physician to do the right kind of therapy. So I think that's one of the what's happening. It's one of the more interesting and systemic uses of precision medicine for a very specific purpose, because it's trying to control hospital-acquired infections and infectious disease by doing rapid-fire genomic testing and getting that whole sequence data to work with, but also applying it immediately to a serious life-threatening situation. I think that's a really interesting application, like I said, of the sort of thing outside of cancer and rare disease where it's really taking off with genetic profiling, things like that.
Well, let me say this. I mean, I was one of the panelists at Converge that's going to be on David's panel is Wilson Tang from Cleveland Clinic. He's one of the most respected genomic folks there. And when I talked about this idea of how are consumers going to handle this information, he said they're just going to go to their doctors, right? Or he made a joke about that. But I wonder if that's, I mean, are most physicians, when we talk about interpreting these tests or giving empowering information from our points of view, are they prepped for this? I mean, is anybody ready to deal with the information that people are going to give when they look at their genome?
I forget what the specific quote is, but it's been circled around a lot. Just that medicine is going to be 1 part doctors and 2 part data or something like that, because there's no way that the doctors. There was a statistic where it was a doctor would have to read about medical literature for 120 hours a week to even attempt to keep up with all the stuff that's coming out. So no. Going to the doctor is not going to be the be-all, end-all to try and interpret data. That's why I was mentioning the artificial intelligence company. I think that in the not-so-distant future, there will be fairly reliable ways to compute the info that's in the genome. We're getting there. We're not quite there yet, so I don't necessarily trust, as you said, the results that come out of 23andMe. But I think it's on its way.
David, what are your thoughts?
I guess I'm kind of spoiled because I live I live in an area, Research Triangle Park, where we have a lot of cutting-edge physicians who are at the forefront of science as well. But that's not the case everywhere, and that's not even the case 15 miles away from here. And I think that this is where, believe it or not, I feel that there's a good thing about regulation. When the FDA approves some sort of medical device or diagnostic test, there's a whole bunch of data that's gone into showing the relevance of each particular finding, and then what kind of medical action should be taken, a clotting factor, for example, and so I think that physicians, because they're so busy, Meghana, is that they rely on the drug approval or the diagnostic approval process to sift through all this other information. But now we've got this new playing field, right, where you have all these direct-to-consumer bits of genomic information that are going out, and it's not filtered, and it's just like people coming into their doctors with bottles of herbs and supplements. It's the kind of thing docs aren't very familiar with. Could be causing problems, maybe not. Might even be helping, but I think that that's where we are with what's going to happen with patients coming in with this complex information They've already tried to interpret it, and now someone who's responsible for their entire healthcare is going to have to interpret it in that context.
It's kind of interesting that you just mentioned, like, the approval process is something that, lends credence to a diagnostic or treatment for a physician. Because this week, did you read about the Precision Fda announcement, David?
I actually didn't. No, I saw it come across, but go ahead.
Meghana, share with us, yeah.
Yeah, so this is part of the Precision Medicine Initiative through the White House, but basically the FDA has created like an open source platform called Precision Fda that's going to allow researchers to like I'm not going to do a good job of describing this, but they're going to allow researchers to collaborate around the data that gets spat out of diagnostic tests. Because I guess the idea is that with these next-gen tests, especially if you're using next-gen sequencing, you may be testing for one disease, but you are getting data about everything, right? So, I think what the FDA is trying to do with this like open source platform is allowing researchers to check and balance themselves to, see if this diagnostic is really giving the right kind of information. So one researcher will have an access to another researcher's or to another company's like, genomic data, I think, something like that. So, so it's an interesting idea anyway because it's meant to help regulators come up with new ways to monitor next-gen sequencing as we, use all this stuff for precision medicine.
So I mean, we brought up a good point, right? So the doctors aren't really going to be prepared to handle genomic information. I don't think if the doctor's not, the consumer not necessarily. I hate to use the word responsible. One of the political debates was in Cleveland, and so we know the realm of responsibility and the definition of it is broad and wide, right? But people are going to have this data when it comes to genomic information, and they're going to make decisions based off it. We've talked about data and analytics to it, but I wonder if there is kind of an aggregated human form. I've often thought of, what role is patients like me or other simple kind of patient groups going to provide when it will help people with decision making. I don't know how you integrate those, but is there a way to draw on the crowd to help with this? And I'll throw this out to anybody. Stephanie, what do you think about that?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I think that if it's not available now, then it will be soon. It's one of those needs that seems to kind of fall in. I mean, are you talking about something in the way of like a genetic counselor that would be part of these communities?
Well, I would say it's a genetic counselor, but think about it this way: you get your reading or your readout from your genetic test. You've gotten some information that's going to have to come along with it. The FDA did mandate that, but you're still searching for information. You're searching for kind of more feedback, right? How helpful is it to somehow incorporate, some of these patient groups and the anecdotal feedback? I know that's a hot topic when you talk about how do you include them in the clinical trials information and things, but
sure.
Where's that power of the crowd?
Because everything that happens in patients like me, I mean that information is available to the companies that subscribe to that. So there will probably be some people that are very open about wanting to get insight as far as sharing each other's experiences, but there's probably a certain amount that's going to want to be a little bit more private about it. I know that's not a very good answer.
No.
But isn't it true that like companies like 23andMe are sort of doing that anyway with all these like massive questionnaires that they're sending out to their users to, I mean,
sort of doing. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh no, go ahead, please.
No, I just wanted you to articulate a little bit more. doing what? Doing this anyway.
Well, 23andMe is like, reaching out to users like me, who are not getting the health data necessarily, but want to help with like research studies and stuff. So you can fill out like hundreds and hundreds of questions about like whether you like cilantro or whatever, and
in fact, that's where the cilantro paper came from 78,000 responses on surveys like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that like what you're sort of hinting at, Chris, is sort of happening already. It's more anonymously where the companies can match up like our responses with our genetic profile, but you know, companies like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, they're definitely crowdsourcing for data right now on a pretty wide scale.
So go ahead, David, please.
I was going to say, the one thing that we underestimate in maybe clinical medicine and disease treatment is the role of public health in public education. Public education programs, the way that people know why it's important to, modify your cholesterol levels if they're too high. And there was actually a paper this week in the New England Journal of Medicine by a couple of public health experts. Ronald Bayer is one of them, and really said that we don't think about that. We look at ourselves who have some health knowledge and a halfway decent income using these kinds of services, but really we're missing this whole swath of people who really can benefit much more from medicine, folks who are in poverty, the racial disparities. And if those people aren't represented in these databases, if their data are not represented, it's actually a missed opportunity for learning more about disease prevalence and how other environmental factors, we haven't gotten into epigenetics, but how other environmental factors interact with variations in the genome to result in a specific health state. And so I mean Bayer went ahead and said that we're way putting the cart ahead of the horse. I think what was his point? He said really I'm sorry, I just missed it. I had it written down here, but anyway, the point being is that is this really predictive medicine for the rich and famous, not the world famous.
Well, I'm glad we're going to wrap it up with one more question here, and this maybe isn't the consumer-driven notice you have, but you just talked about the rich, right? I mean, isn't there going to be a point in time when many consumers wake up and they realize that other companies are making money off their genetic code, and that they're not getting a cut of that? I mean, I think that Lisa Sunan wrote a great piece about Research Kit and questioning that business model. There's an obvious note that people will give their genomic information to an organization if they know it will benefit them, thinking of it, hey, I'm sick, here's my genome, heal me, that'll work. But when they realize that suddenly they're giving their genetic information to all these other organizations and then they're monetizing it without any kind of reciprocation, it just seems like the business model of many genomics companies really is going to shake out wildly. And I don't know if any of you have had thoughts about that or about the whole business model of using other people's genetic information to make tons of cash without any remuneration back to the people whose genetics it is, right?
Yeah, I think that it's kind of crappy, honestly, but I understand that it's a fantastic, opportunity for business, and if you spin it properly, then it absolutely can be helpful, I guess. But
I mean, the whole idea of someone being able to opt out and opt in, I mean, that actually, I mean, that speaking more broadly than the topic that we're talking about, I mean, that's a huge issue. I mean, the idea is, the more data that companies have, the better off they are. The easier it is for them to develop drugs, devices, tools to help us. So that's their argument. If they start making it easier for people to opt in and opt out, then that's that much less data that they're going to get. And so I think it's going to be more difficult to opt out, personally. But I think I mean, it's a real kind of ethical dilemma, but I think probably people get too worried about that their personal information is going to be able to be traced really easily, and I think that's a misconception. But that is a separate issue from the one that Meghana was addressing. That people should get reimbursed, but they'll get the payoff is basically having another treatment, another drug sooner rather than later.
I think a lot of folks don't understand what informed consent means, and when you when you go ahead and pay your $99 to 23andMe, what they're going to be allowed to do with that data, and it's usually much more broad than if you have a skin biopsy at an academic medical center. There are usually probably there are probably greater restrictions on that. So I would encourage consumers to look at the look at the fine print and see what their information is going to be used for. And that's been a continual issue in actually academic medicine of people just giving up their tissue samples, and that as a function of them receiving care, that benefits the entire medical enterprise. Well, that's okay. Most things, but there's still profit to be made there. It's not as intensive as with some of these other companies, though.
No, it's true. I mean, I gave up my kids' umbilical cord just for the promise that if I gave up, the stem cells and the materials there, we would get a give back just in case there was an issue or a crisis, right? So,
that's a good point.
But let's look back as we always do. Thank you very much, everybody, for talking about that topic. It's going to be probably one of the highlights of the conversation at Converge. One of our keynote speakers is Alberto Gutierrez, who has a huge role in the FDA in deciding some of these things. And then, as I think we've mentioned, Wilson Tang from Cleveland Clinic, Emily Golenkoff, who founded Emily's Entourage, and then we have the CEO of Boston Heart Diagnostics, and then somebody from Ancestry DNA, all coming to David's panel to talk more about this topic. It's obviously very, very important. We always wrap up MedHeads, though, going through some of the other big stories that happened this week. And so I'll just go around the horn, so to speak, and ask everybody what they thought some of the more interesting news was happening here in the business of innovation of healthcare. And Stephanie, we'll begin with you.
Okay. Well, there was a company called Gobiquity that I wrote about this week. They developed basically a test for a vision test, basically, and the idea is that physicians, primary care physicians, would administer this test to reduce, to identify risk factors for certain vision problems, so that there is treatment earlier to prevent something terrible from happening, like either a diminished vision or loss of vision entirely later on. And it's interesting because they really focused. Andrew Burns, who's the CEO I spoke with there, really focused on this as a kind of value-added care. This idea that you're administering a test and providing an easier way to administer a test now, so you can avoid a more expensive problem down the road. And it's similar in some ways to an app that Johns Hopkins developed, and I wrote about them pretty recently. It was a company. It's an app called PoopMD, and the idea is that new parents worry about so many different things. There are so many different things that can go wrong with their child. They're worried about, are they breathing correctly? Are they crying too much? Is their heart racing? Is a heart beating? Do they have a pulse? All these things, and yet the physician I was speaking with, the pediatric specialist I was speaking with about this, that helped develop this app, said, there's a really if parents just paid more attention to sort of what are worrying colors of their feces rather than everything else, there is actually a symptom of what can turn out to be a pretty serious liver disease down the road. And if this app is designed to help parents take pictures of their poop, and within sort of the first 2 months of their life, and it helps them determine whether this is it's a color that they should be concerned about and take their child to a pediatric their pediatrician, or it's okay. What?
No, Stefan, you cover more ground in these news items than anybody else in healthcare, I tell you.
Okay.
You went from if Go Big Footy is making a poop app, man, this is the greatest thing ever.
No, these are two different companies.
I know, okay.
They're targeting value-based care. It's interesting.
Meghana, how about you?
The FDA approved the first ever 3D printed drug, which is pretty interesting. It's the first time that 3D printing has been applied to pharmaceuticals in an approved way. It's from a company called Precision Pharmaceuticals in Ohio. And the drug's called Spritum or something, and it's for epilepsy. And I guess some people have really high doses of medication when they take an epilepsy drug, and it's really hard to take it. So the idea with this drug is that they've layered it in this kind of molecular way where it's they've infused water or liquid with the drug itself, so that just with a sip of liquid it'll dissolve, and you can take a very large dose in a pretty painless way. So so it's cool because this company is gonna expand 3D printed pharmaceutical options for a bunch of CNS drugs, yeah, I mean it'll be interesting to watch how 3D printing is applied in pharmaceuticals moving forward. I mean, the most obvious use would be in dosage. You can use 3D printing to create the right kind of dosage made just for you. Yeah, I think that was a really big story, and I think we'll probably see more of that moving forward.
And David, what about you?
And I was actually going to say, just to add on to that, I think that you're going to see compounding pharmacies latching onto the 3D printing of drugs. Their whole business model is based around personalized dosage forms that aren't available commercially. So my big story this week actually came from consumer personal care products. Folks have probably heard about Jessica Alba's company, The Honest Company, being absolutely hammered on social media for their so-called natural sunscreen product that apparently was not working in a subset of patients and a whole subset of consumers, sorry, and they were posting pictures predominantly of their children with horrible sunburns, claiming that the sunscreen didn't work. And that led to a whole discussion about how are sunscreens regulated with these consumer products. A lot of people are taking these as using sunscreens as a preventive drug for skin cancer, at least for minimizing skin aging and wrinkles. And what is the responsibility on the companies to provide a product that meets certain standards? The Honest Company got hammered by PR professionals early on for their first statement that said, essentially blamed the users for not using the product appropriately. It was supposed to be shaken. It's in a lotion bottle, a lotion tube, not a bottle. It's not really something I would think of as needing to be shaken. And they said that, well, it's not really that big of a deal because only 0.5% of their customers have complained so far. And all hell broke loose. So essentially, what you really don't know is where are users not applying it correctly or repeatedly applying it, or was there some quality control problem? They changed the formulation. It was made of zinc oxide. If you remember, lifeguards using the baby bottom zinc oxide on their noses, and they reduced the concentration about 50%. Because people were complaining about what it looked like when they put it on their skin and it stayed white. It really was a whole big mess, and the company didn't recall the medicine. Instead, they actually decided they were going to make things right with customers on a one-on-one basis through their customer care line. They even went so far as to check people. Yeah, exactly, right. They went right ahead and contacted people through social media who had posted things and offered them all sorts of whatever other products, whatever to sort of satisfy them. So very interesting. It's a $1 billion company, and they took a big PR hit, tried to recover. It'll be very interesting to see what comes out of this, because I guarantee that Health Canada and the FDA are going to look into what happened to this product.
No, that's fascinating. I think my big story this week, I'm big in a believer, people often say that they're diagnostics created with no solutions or applications necessarily. And I think you're seeing that in telehealth a little bit. And it was really interesting to see the story that MedCity published, I think it was from Kaiser Health, about the fact that when you talk about seniors and you talk about rural health, one of the most effective tools is the telephone. Right? It isn't Skype, it isn't video, it isn't some of the things that you see, promoted heavily. It's the most simple approaches, and that if you're engaging on the telephone with a senior, you're going to see major movement in their health, or notable movement in their health at least. And I think it was a good reminder, and I think it's some of the things that we just talked about here, is some of these simple and straightforward approaches. If they apply and are a real solution, you're going to see real results. And I always like that. There are a couple telemedicine companies that often tell me this, that the most popular product they have is simply telephonic, and it's what the consumers are demanding. And I think that this is more evidence that some of the simplest solutions are going to be most effective, and not necessarily the sexy ones. So I thought that was one of the great takeaways. And I want to thank everybody for sticking with us for this episode of MedHeads. From San Diego, Meghana Keshavan. From Research Triangle Park, David Kroll. And from beautiful Philadelphia, Stephanie Baum. And I'm Chris Seper, based here in lovely Cleveland. I hope you're all back next week. And David, thank you again for staying with us and being our guest.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you at MedCity Converge.
Take care.